3 patrol cars blocked my driveway at 6 a.m. My twin daughters froze on the porch, watching in terror. Across the street, my neighbor smiled and told police I was using military intimidation. She was wrong, because that phone call didn't get me arrested. It summoned her straight into my command office. The morning air was still cool, the kind that usually carries the smell of fresh coffee and cut grass. Instead, it carried the low hum of idling engines and the unmistakable weight of authority pressing into my front yard. Red and blue lights washed over the garage door, over the bicycles leaned against the fence, over the chalk drawings my kids had left from the night before. My daughters stood shoulder to shoulder on the porch. They didn't cry, they didn't speak. They just watched, wide-eyed, trying to understand why police cars were blocking their father from leaving his own home. Across the street, my neighbor held her phone like a badge. She didn't look frightened, she looked satisfied. One officer stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on his belt, his voice careful and rehearsed. "Sir, we received a complaint about threatening behavior. Threatening, for parking in my own driveway." I nodded, I listened. I did what years of training had taught me to do when situations escalated for no good reason. I stayed calm, I answered questions, I kept my hands visible, I gave my name. Behind the officers, my neighbor wore that tight, practiced smile, the kind people wear when they think the system is finally working in their favor. What she couldn't see, what she didn't understand, was that this wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning. And sometimes, a phone call meant to humiliate a man in his own driveway does the exact opposite. It becomes the reason you are summoned, very formally, into a command office. Only this time, you're on the wrong side of the desk. People hear the word commander and imagine shouting, orders, a man who fills a room by force of rank. That's not who I am at home. At home, I'm the guy who wakes up before sunrise to make coffee strong enough to cut through the fog of a long night. I'm the one who checks the locks before bed, not because I'm afraid, but because habit is a kind of comfort. I'm a father first, a son second. Everything else comes after. I've spent more than 2 decades in uniform. Enough years to learn that authority doesn't come from volume. It comes from steadiness, from showing up when it matters, from keeping your word when nobody's watching. I've stood in places most people only see on the evening news. Places where the air smells like dust and diesel and fear. Places where the wrong decision costs lives. Those experiences change you, but not in the way people assume. They don't make you loud. They make you careful. They make you value quiet mornings and ordinary routines. They make you protect the small, fragile things that remind you why you go to work in the first place, like family. My twin daughters were 10 that year, old enough to notice when something isn't right, old enough to read faces. They didn't need explanations. They just needed consistency. Breakfast at the same time, backpacks by the door. A dad who didn't flinch when the world outside the house started acting strange. My wife was away on official travel, the kind of travel that keeps you awake at night, even when you trust the system, because distance has a way of amplifying worry. We talked when we could. Short calls, familiar reassurances. Everything's fine. The kind of lie you tell gently, so it sounds like the truth. And then there was my father, 73 years old, a Vietnam veteran, a man who once carried responsibility the hard way, and now carried confusion he didn't ask for. Some days he remembered everything. Some days he remembered nothing. The days that hurt the most were the ones where he looked at me just a second too long, searching for a name he knew he should know. But every morning, every single morning, he'd perk up when he heard my voice. Something about the cadence, the tone, the way I spoke when I was getting ready for the day, it cut through the haze in his mind like a familiar song. He'd sit at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, and for a few minutes, he was back. Back in a time when duty meant something clear, when right and wrong were still sharp around the edges. That house wasn't just a place we lived, it was an anchor. And anchors matter when everything else feels like it's drifting. That's why what happened in the driveway mattered more than a parking space, more than an HOA rule, more than a neighbor with too much time and a phone full of authority she didn't earn. Because when you threaten a man's home, you're not challenging his patience, you're challenging his purpose. I didn't move into that neighborhood looking for conflict. I didn't expect special treatment. I didn't assume respect because of a title or a uniform. I believed, maybe foolishly, That if you minded your business, treated people fairly, and showed up for your community, that would be enough. For a long time, it was. Until one person decided that peace was optional. That control mattered more than decency. That paperwork could do what confrontation couldn't. And that was the moment. Long before the police cars, long before the reports and the meetings, when a quiet life started to turn into something else. Something deliberate, something personal. Karen moved in 6 months before everything went sideways. At first, she was just another new face on the street, a wave from across the road, a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The kind of neighbor you nod to, exchange small talk with, and then forget about as you go on with your day. She lived directly across from us. That mattered more than I realized at the time. Karen drove a white SUV that always sat in her driveway at the exact same angle, every single day. Her lawn was trimmed with surgical precision. No weeds, no stray leaves. The place looked less like a home and more like a display model, something meant to be judged rather than lived in. She introduced herself within the first week, friendly enough, asked where we were from, asked how long we planned to stay. That second question stuck with me. Most people ask how you like the neighborhood, or whether the schools are good. Karen wanted to know our timeline. I told her the truth. We'd been there for years. We weren't going anywhere. She smiled. Again, that tight smile. "Oh," she said. "Military families usually don't stay long." It didn't sound curious. It sounded conclusive. Karen made a point of mentioning her role on the HOA board early on. Treasurer, she said, like it was a credential rather than a volunteer position. She talked about rules the way some people talk about laws of nature, unchangeable, unquestionable, and enforced for your own good. I nodded. I listened. I didn't argue. Years in uniform teach you something simple. Not every hill is worth standing on. At first, the comments were subtle, little observations tossed into casual conversation. It must be hard for kids moving around all the time. Or, I worry about stability in neighborhoods with too many temporary residents. Always said with a soft voice. Always wrapped in concern. But concern has a way of curdling when it's not sincere. I started noticing patterns. Karen was always outside when we were, not obviously following us, just appearing, watering her lawn when the kids came home from school, checking her mail when I backed the truck into the driveway, standing at her window during evening walks, phone in hand, screen glowing, watching. She spoke often about property values, about appearances, about maintaining standards. She said those words a lot. Standards. As if people were measurements rather than neighbors. One afternoon, she commented on my truck. "That's a big vehicle for a residential street," she said, glancing at it the way someone looks at clutter. "It feels aggressive." Aggressive. I'd heard that word before, usually from people who confuse quiet confidence with threat. I told her it was just a pickup truck. I used it for work, for errands, for hauling the things a family needs when life actually happens. She nodded, but her eyes didn't move. They stayed fixed on the truck, calculating. Later, I learned her husband had recently been passed over for a significant contract tied to the base. A maintenance deal worth more money than most people see in a lifetime. She never mentioned it directly, but resentment has a way of leaking out. To her, I wasn't just a neighbor. I was a reminder of the system that had rejected them. I was the uniform that had said no. After that, the comments sharpened. "I don't understand why military families need special accommodations," she said once, out of nowhere. "Civilians follow the rules. Everyone should." I told her we did follow the rules. She smiled again. "That's what we're here to make sure of." The shift was subtle, but it was there. Conversations became inspections. Questions became notes. Friendly waves turned into measured stares. Karen wasn't loud. She wasn't emotional. She didn't rant or threaten. She observed. She documented. She believed, truly believed, that order was something she had the right to impose. That authority was something you claimed by persistence, not earned by trust. I didn't confront her. I didn't escalate. I didn't give her what she wanted. I went on living my life. Looking back, that's what bothered her most. Because people who crave control don't hate chaos. They hate independence. And the more calmly I went about my days, the more I refused to react, the more she watched. And the more she watched, the clearer it became that Karen wasn't just a neighbor with opinions. She was someone waiting for a moment she could turn into leverage. waiting for a reason to use the system she loved so much. And when that reason finally came, she didn't hesitate. It happened on a Tuesday morning, the kind that feels ordinary enough to be invisible. The sun was barely up. The neighborhood was quiet in that brief window between night and routine, before garbage trucks, before school buses, before the world remembered it had somewhere to be. I angled my truck slightly in the driveway to make room for my daughter's bikes, leaned against the fence where they always left them. Nothing dramatic, nothing unusual. I was halfway back toward the house when I heard the sound of heels on pavement. Fast, purposeful. Karen crossed the street with her phone already in her hand. Not tucked away, not casual. Held upright, camera facing forward like she was documenting a crime scene. "You can't park like that," she said, without greeting, without preamble. I looked at the truck, then at the driveway, then back at her. "It's my driveway," I said. Calm, neutral, the way you speak when you don't want a conversation to become something else. She started taking pictures. Click, click. "This is a residential neighborhood," she said, "not a military base." There it was, the line she'd been rehearsing. "The angle blocks sight lines," she continued, narrating into her phone. "Emergency vehicles need clear access. This is intimidating behavior." Intimidating, because of a pickup truck, because of a man standing quietly in his own driveway. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't step closer. I didn't argue. I'd learned long ago that escalation rarely favors the person who stays composed. "Ma'am," I said. "This is private property." She smiled and dialed. "Hello, police," she said, loud enough for me to hear. "I need to report threatening behavior. A neighbor using military intimidation tactics." She didn't look at me when she said it. She looked at her screen, like the decision had already been made. 20 minutes later, the first patrol car rolled in, then another. By the time the third one arrived, I realized why. Dispatch didn't hear parking dispute. They heard military intimidation. She knew exactly which keywords would trigger a priority 1 response. My daughters were on the porch by then, backpacks at their feet, watching the scene unfold like it was happening on someone else's street. The first officer stepped out slowly, measured, professional. He recognized me. I could tell by the hesitation in his eyes. We'd crossed paths before at community meetings. He knew my record. He knew how absurd this was, but he also knew the rules. "Sir," he said, keeping his tone even, "we received a complaint about threatening behavior." I nodded. "I understand." He asked the questions he had to ask, where I was standing, whether I'd spoken to my neighbor, whether I'd raised my voice, whether there were any weapons involved. "No," I said. "No, and no." Karen stood a few steps behind him, nodding along with every word, clutching her phone like it was evidence that might evaporate if she loosened her grip. While one officer spoke with her, the first officer stepped closer to me. His voice dropped. "Look," he said quietly, eyes flicking toward Karen. "I know this is ridiculous, sir." I didn't say anything. I let him continue. "But if I don't write it up," he added, even quieter, "she calls the chief." There it was, the real dynamic. This wasn't about public safety. It wasn't about noise or parking or sight lines. It was about pressure, about knowing which buttons to push, about wearing people down until the system did what you wanted it to do just to make the problem go away. I nodded again, not in agreement, in understanding. "Do what you need to do," I said. He did. He documented. He noted. He checked boxes that would later look official and neutral on paper, stripped of context and human expression. When it was over, the officers left with visible relief. Karen stayed behind, watching them drive off, satisfaction written all over her face. My daughters didn't move. I walked up the porch steps and knelt in front of them. "You okay?" I asked. They nodded. "Barely." "Did I do something wrong?" one of them asked. "No," I said. "You didn't do anything wrong. Neither had I." And that was the point. That morning changed something. Not because of a ticket, not because of a report, but because it revealed the shape of the fight I was in. Karen wasn't reacting. She was initiating. She wasn't misunderstanding. She was testing how far she could push, how much leverage she had, how easily she could turn a routine morning into an official incident. And she learned something important that day. The system would bend. All she had to do was apply enough pressure. What she didn't realize, what she couldn't see yet, was that pressure works both ways, and the more she used it, the clearer her patterns would become. Patterns have a way of telling the truth. The first letter arrived 2 days later. White envelope, HOA logo in the corner, my name spelled correctly, address printed clean and straight, like it mattered. I stood at the kitchen counter and opened it while the coffee finished brewing, already knowing what it would be. Notice of violation. The language was precise, polite, almost friendly. It cited a subsection I'd never heard of, something about vehicle positioning and visual obstruction. No accusation, no explanation, just a date, a code, and a fine amount printed at the bottom like a quiet threat. By the end of the week, there were 3 more. Different envelopes, different subsections, different alleged witnesses. Each one felt less like a complaint and more like a move in a game where the rules were written by the same person who kept score. I didn't throw them away. I didn't call anyone. I didn't vent. I started a folder, manila, plain, labeled with a pen, dates on the tabs, copies inside, photos attached, notes in the margins. Not because I enjoyed it, but because experience had taught me something simple. When authority shows up wearing a smile, documentation is the only language it understands. My wife called that night from her hotel room. I heard about the police, she said. She tried to keep her voice even. She didn't quite succeed. It's handled, I told her. Everyone's okay. There was a pause on the line. Static hissed in the background. Thousands of miles of distance heavy between us. I'm useless here, she whispered, her voice cracking. I can't protect you guys from a hotel room? The words hit harder than any HOA letter. You don't need to, I said, keeping my voice steady. That's my watch. She didn't answer right away. When she did, it was just a quiet, okay. We both knew what that meant. The letters kept coming. Noise violation, for starting my truck at 6:30 a.m., unauthorized modification, for tightening a fence board that had come loose, improper display, for a flag mounted 1 inch outside the approved guideline. Each notice arrived with the same calm tone. Each one assumed guilt without saying the word. Each one added another line to the ledger. My daughter started noticing the mail before I did. Another one of them asked, holding an envelope like it might bite. It's just paper, I said. Paper can't hurt us. She nodded. I could tell she didn't believe me. My father watched quietly from his chair, eyes following the exchange. Some days he asked questions, some days he didn't. That week, he didn't. Late one evening, after the kids were asleep and the house had settled into its nighttime creaks, I spread the letters out across the dining table. The surface disappeared beneath them. Dates, codes, amounts, patterns trying to hide in plain sight. That's when it clicked. The violations weren't random. They weren't even reactive. They were timed, spaced just far enough apart to feel relentless, but not enough to look coordinated at a glance. Each one cited a different rule, a different section, a different rationale. It was careful, professional. Someone had read the bylaws the way others read maps. I started cross-referencing, not aggressively, quietly. I pulled public records, meeting minutes, old notices posted online. I compared enforcement actions over the past 2 years, marking them with a pen the way I used to mark timelines, looking for clusters, overlaps, absences. By midnight, the picture was clearer. Military families made up less than a quarter of the neighborhood. They accounted for nearly 3/4 of the violations. The same infractions, noise, parking, fences, earned warnings for some residents and citations for others. Names repeated, addresses clustered, patterns emerging where randomness was supposed to live. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe. This wasn't overzealous enforcement. This was selective enforcement. And selective enforcement isn't about rules. It's about targets. The next morning, Karen waved as I backed the truck out. Cheerful, polite, like none of it had anything to do with her. I waved back. Not because I wanted peace, because I wanted time. Time to watch, time to document, time to let her believe the pressure was working. That afternoon, another envelope arrived. I added it to the folder. For the first time since the police left my driveway, I didn't feel surprised. I felt oriented, like I finally understood the terrain. Karen thought she was burying me in paperwork. What she didn't realize was that paperwork leaves fingerprints, and the more she sent, the clearer the pattern became. Patterns have a way of doing that. They tell the truth, quietly, patiently, until someone finally listens. The first sign wasn't a letter. It was my daughter's face when she came through the front door. She didn't run like she usually did, didn't talk over her sister. She set her backpack down carefully, like it weighed more than books, and stood there for a second too long before speaking. "Dad," she said, "Mrs. Ellie said I can't be safety patrol captain anymore." I knelt in front of her, the way you do when something matters. Why would she say that? She shrugged. Kids learn that move early, the one that hides confusion behind small shoulders. She said our family might move soon, that it wouldn't be fair. Fair. Her sister appeared behind her, jaw set tight. Tommy's mom said military families are just passing through, that we don't really belong. The words landed heavier than any citation. I hugged them both. Felt their ribs rise and fall too fast. Felt the quiet shame kids carry when adults turn them into problems without ever saying it out loud. "We're not going anywhere," I said. "And you belong wherever you stand." They nodded. They believed me, or maybe they needed to. From the living room, my father watched. Some days he was somewhere else entirely. Some days he drifted in and out, names and places sliding past him like scenery from a moving train. That day, he was present. Fully. After the girls went upstairs, after the house settled into that uneasy quiet that follows tears, I found him sitting at the kitchen table. His hands were folded, his eyes sharp in a way I hadn't seen in weeks. He didn't look confused. He looked experienced. "She reminds me of the political officers," he said suddenly. I stopped. "In Saigon," he continued, his voice steady, unhurried. "Didn't carry rifles, carried paperwork. Smiled while they ruined lives. Said it was for order, for stability." He looked up at me then. "Same eyes," he said. "Same hunger to control people who don't belong to her." Then, just as quickly, the moment passed. His gaze drifted. The clarity softened. The war receded back into wherever his mind kept it now, but the words stayed. Later that week, at the school board meeting, I saw exactly what he meant. Karen moved through the room like she belonged at the center of it, shaking hands, smiling, leaning in close when she spoke. She wore a blazer and the kind of expression people practice in mirrors, concerned, responsible, civic-minded. When she took the podium, the room quieted. "Military families," she said with careful emphasis, "bring unique challenges to our community. Frequent relocations, deployment stress, behavioral adjustments that can disrupt learning environments." She clicked to the next slide. Charts, percentages, selective studies taken out of context and lined up like evidence. It was polished, professional, and completely dishonest. I felt my jaw tighten. Then she crossed the line. "Take Colonel," she paused, glancing in my direction without quite looking at me. "This neighborhood's recent issues as an example. Complaints, intimidation, instability. And now, unfortunately, the effects are showing up in our schools." She didn't say my name. She didn't need to. In that moment, I saw her exactly as my father had. Not loud, not angry, not chaotic. Organized, smiling, certain. A woman who believed paperwork could do what force could not. That was when something shifted inside me. Not rage, something colder, more precise. This wasn't ignorance. This was a campaign. Karen wasn't just filing HOA complaints. She was shaping narratives, feeding institutions the language they needed to justify exclusion without ever calling it what it was. At home that night, my wife called again. "They're talking about the kids," she said before I could say hello. "Other spouses are hearing it too." "How many?" I asked. "Enough." I closed my eyes and let the silence stretch. "Okay," I said finally. "Then it's time." "For what?" she asked. "For me to stop pretending this will burn out on its own." I hung up and opened the folder. The manila one was thick now. Letters, dates, notes, and something else I hadn't paid enough attention to yet. Meeting minutes, attendance lists, names that kept reappearing in different places at different times. HOA, school, committees, connections. I added a new tab and wrote a word across it in block letters. Children. Because once someone is willing to use kids as leverage, there's no misunderstanding left, no benefit of the doubt, no room for patience. That was the night I stopped asking why this was happening and started asking how it was coordinated, how information was moving, how the same language kept showing up in different mouths. Karen thought she was applying pressure where it hurt. She was right. She just misjudged what happens when you push a parent far enough, especially one who knows how to read patterns. And patterns, once you start really looking, don't just tell you what is happening, they tell you who is behind it. The house was quiet in that deep, late-night way that only comes after everyone else has gone to sleep. No cartoons murmuring from the living room, no footsteps overhead, just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock marking time like it always had, indifferent to whatever was happening inside the people who lived beneath it. I opened my laptop at the dining table and pulled the folder closer. Not the manila one, the digital one. I wasn't looking for proof yet. Proof implies doubt. What I was looking for was structure, organization, the kind of order people create when they believe they're being careful. HOA boards are required to keep records, minutes, violation logs, correspondence. Most of it is boring, redundant, forgotten the moment it's filed. But bureaucracy has a blind spot. It assumes nobody will ever read everything. I did. I started with meeting minutes from the past 2 years, downloaded them, lined them up by date, cross-referenced attendance lists with voting records. Names began to repeat, not randomly, consistently. Then I found the shared drive. It wasn't hidden. It didn't need to be. It sat behind a login that most residents never bothered to request because, frankly, most people don't expect to be targeted by their own neighborhood. Inside were folders labeled by year. Inside those, subfolders. One of them stopped me cold. Compliance monitoring. I clicked. The file inside was an Excel spreadsheet. Simple, clean, professional, and devastating. Rows of names, addresses, dates, notes, columns labeled status, action, escalation. Another column caught my eye. Occupancy type, civilian. Civilian, military, civilian, military. I scrolled. The military entries were highlighted, yellow at first, then red. Next to my address, a note read, persistent non-compliance. Recommend pressure escalation. My hands didn't shake. Not yet. I opened another tab. School liaison notes? That one wasn't supposed to exist. It contained dates of meetings, names of committee members, and shorthand phrases that looked harmless until you read them together. Leadership instability, relocation risk, community continuity concerns. Next to my daughter's name was a single line that felt like a punch to the chest. Target to remove. Not review, not reconsider, remove. I sat back in the chair and stared at the screen, letting the meaning settle. This wasn't enforcement. This wasn't bias. This was planning. I moved methodically after that, saved copies, took screenshots, downloaded metadata, checked timestamps, user accounts, edit histories. The same 3 names appeared again and again across HOA records, school notes, and committee communications. Karen's name was on every single one, sometimes as the author, sometimes as a reviewer, sometimes as the last person who'd opened the file before an action was taken. She wasn't reacting to events. She was coordinating them. The spreadsheet tracked outcomes, who complied, who paid, who pushed back, and who needed more pressure. Another column labeled desired outcome. For civilians, it read compliance achieved. For military families, it read relocation likely. That was when the room felt smaller. Not because I was afraid, but because the scale of it snapped into focus. This wasn't personal animosity that got out of hand. It was strategy. I checked one more file before closing the laptop. A worksheet titled Communications. It logged calls, emails, informal conversations. Dates matched the days my kids came home quieter than usual. The days the school office called. The days HOA letters arrived back to back. The spreadsheet didn't raise its voice. It didn't have to. It spoke in patterns. I closed the laptop and sat there for a long time, listening to the clock. At some point, my father shuffled into the doorway. He looked smaller in the dim light, older, more fragile. "You working late again?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Just reading." He nodded, satisfied with that answer, and went back to bed. I didn't sleep. By morning, the decision was made. Not to confront, not to accuse, not yet. Documentation first, preservation, corroboration. I reached out quietly. A neighbor here, a parent there. I didn't lead. I listened. Stories matched the spreadsheet almost line for line. Same phrases, same pressures, same outcomes. By the end of the day, I had copies stored in 3 places and a list of witnesses who didn't even know they were witnesses yet. Karen thought she'd built a system too complex to challenge. What she'd actually built was a record. And records don't argue, they don't shout, they don't take sides. They just sit there, patient and permanent, waiting for the moment someone decides to read them out loud. That night, I added one last tab to the folder: evidence. Because once you have the map, the next step isn't emotion, it's action. And for the first time since the police cars left my driveway, I knew exactly what that action would look like. Once you see the map, you stop seeing coincidences. You see intersections. I printed the spreadsheet and taped the pages to the wall of my home office. Not because I needed paper, but because patterns reveal themselves differently when you can step back and look at the whole thing at once. Names became nodes. Dates became lines. Actions became arrows pointing in only one direction. Karen sat at the center, not alone, but central. Every time an HOA notice went out to a military family, a school concern appeared within days. Every time a parent meeting raised questions about stability, a compliance letter followed close behind. The timing wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. It was consistent enough to be intentional. I started making quiet calls, not accusations, not confrontations, just questions, the kind that let people talk if they wanted to. A mother from 2 streets over told me her son had been removed from student council after a routine review. She used the same phrase Karen had used at the school board meeting: continuity concerns. She didn't know where it came from. She just knew it was said with a smile. A neighbor who had lived there for 15 years admitted he'd received a warning for the same fence issue I'd been fined for. A warning, no paperwork, no follow-up. He was civilian. He hadn't thought much of it. A teacher, off the record, confirmed that certain names came with context attached. Nothing official, just notes, reminders. Guidance passed quietly from one meeting to the next. Context is what institutions use when they don't want to write things down. I logged every conversation: date, time, who spoke first, who repeated which phrases. Language matters. It travels. By midweek, the map was crowded. 3 HOA board members appeared again and again in the records. 2 of them overlapped with a parent committee at the school. 1 attended city planning meetings as a concerned resident. None of it was illegal by itself. That was the point. It was adjacency. Influence without fingerprints. I checked public calendars, meeting minutes, volunteer rosters. The same faces rotated through different rooms, carrying the same concerns, speaking the same language, always just on the safe side of plausible deniability. Karen wasn't improvising. She was orchestrating. I built a simple timeline, laid it next to the spreadsheet. Events snapped into alignment, complaint filed, school concern raised, HOA escalation, social pressure, suggested relocation, over and over. I added a new layer to the map. Resources. Who had access to what? Who controlled information? Who benefited when families left quietly? Homes vacated by military families were resold quickly, often with enthusiastic notes about community stability. Then I found the foreclosure, a young sergeant. First deployment behind him, second one looming. His wife had tried to make it work, but the isolation got to her. The quiet pressure, the whispers at school, the feeling that the neighborhood wanted them gone. They divorced. He lost the house. And when I followed the paper trail, my stomach tightened. The property had been purchased below market value through an LLC, Karen's LLC. She didn't just drive them out. She profited from the wreckage. That was the moment the map stopped being abstract. This wasn't about standards. It wasn't about order. It was about leverage and reward. Late one afternoon, my wife called again. "You sound different," she said. "I am," I replied. "In a good way?" "In a focused way." I told her what I'd found. Not everything, just enough. She was quiet for a moment. "So it's not just us." "No," I said. "It never was." "That makes it worse," she said. "It makes it clearer," I corrected. That night, I added one more page to the wall, a blank one. At the top, I wrote a single word: exposure. Not confrontation, not retaliation, exposure. Because networks don't collapse when you argue with them. They collapse when you illuminate them. I knew what came next. Corroboration, independent verification, third-party review, the kind of scrutiny that doesn't care about smiles or intentions, only records. Karen had built her operation on the assumption that nobody would ever connect the dots. That assumption was her weakness. I took photos of the wall, backed everything up, encrypted copies, shared access with one trusted person outside the neighborhood. If something happened to me, the map would still exist. Before I turned off the light, I looked at the center of the map one last time. Karen's name sat there, surrounded by lines she'd drawn herself. She thought she was invisible because she was quiet. She was wrong. Quiet is exactly how patterns hide, and exactly how they're found. There's a line most people don't realize exists. It's not painted on the ground, it's not posted on a sign. But once you cross it, everything changes. Karen crossed it on a Thursday afternoon. I didn't know it at the time. I was at my desk, working through routine reports, when my phone buzzed with a notification I almost ignored. Almost. It was an email, forwarded to me by a colleague who knew my name well enough to recognize when it showed up somewhere it didn't belong. Subject: Civilian Complaint, Officer Conduct Review. The sender wasn't local law enforcement. It wasn't the HOA. It wasn't the school district. It was a federal inbox. I opened it. Karen hadn't just complained to the HOA anymore. She hadn't stopped at the police department. She had filed a formal report to a federal agency, alleging that I was using my position to intimidate civilians, misuse authority, and create a hostile environment for non-military residents. She used the right words, carefully chosen, precisely arranged, the kind of language that doesn't sound emotional, just credible enough to trigger mandatory review. Abuse of authority, retaliation, threatening conduct. She attached supporting documents, photos of my truck, copies of HOA notices, summaries of witness statements that all seemed to echo the same phrases. The spreadsheet's language translated into accusation. That's when I understood what she'd done. By filing a false official statement with a federal agency, Karen hadn't escalated the conflict. She'd transformed it. This was no longer a neighborhood dispute. This was interference with official duties. I didn't respond. I didn't call anyone. I documented. I forwarded the email to legal counsel, then to compliance, then to a secure folder labeled with a date and a single word. Line. That evening, my wife called. "You're quiet," she said. "I'm listening," I replied. To what? To the sound of someone making a mistake they can't undo. She didn't ask me to explain. She didn't need to. We'd both heard that tone before, when a situation stops being emotional and starts becoming procedural. The next morning, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. "Colonel," the voice said, measured and professional, "this is Lieutenant Colonel Webb from Base Security. We need to speak with you regarding a civilian report that crossed our desk." I told her I was available. She didn't ask for details. She didn't accuse. She didn't reassure. She just said, "Bring whatever documentation you have." I brought everything. The HOA letters, the spreadsheet, the network map, the foreclosure records, the recordings, the timestamps. We sat in a quiet room with no windows and good acoustics, the kind of place where words don't echo because they don't need to. Webb read without interruption. At one point, she stopped and looked up. "Did this individual submit this complaint directly?" "Yes," I said. "And the allegations are false?" "Yes." She nodded once, made a note, continued reading. When she finished, she leaned back slightly. "By submitting knowingly false statements to a federal entity," she said, "this individual may have exposed herself to serious consequences." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "This changes jurisdiction," she continued. "It also changes who asks the questions." That afternoon, Karen doubled down. She sent follow-up emails, clarifications, addendums, each one sharper than the last, each one adding details that couldn't be substantiated, each one tightening the knot around her own position. She wasn't trying to correct the record. She was trying to control it. What she didn't realize, what people like her rarely do, is that federal systems don't respond well to manipulation. They respond to patterns, and hers was suddenly very clear. By Monday, the situation had formally shifted. The complaint was no longer being reviewed as a civilian grievance. It was being assessed as a potential false official statement. That meant documentation mattered more than intention, evidence more than narrative. Karen had assumed the uniform worked like a shield. She was wrong. It works like a lens. It magnifies everything, especially lies. Late that night, I stood in my kitchen and stared at the wall, where the map still hung. Lines, names, arrows pointing inward. Karen had believed the system was a ladder, something you climb by stepping on others. She hadn't realized it was also a net, and she'd just wrapped it around herself. I didn't feel triumph. I felt responsibility. Because once the federal line is crossed, you don't get to walk away quietly. Not for your own sake, and not for the people who might come next if you do. The next step wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be public. It would be formal. And it would come with a summons she never expected. The evidence didn't arrive with sirens. It arrived quietly. On a Tuesday afternoon, while I was reviewing routine paperwork, my security system sent a notification to my phone. Not an alert, not a warning, just a recording flagged as unusual audio. I almost ignored it. I shouldn't have. The camera faced the side of my driveway, the edge of the frame where sound mattered more than sight. Karen stood just beyond the lens, phone pressed to her ear, her back half turned. She didn't know the microphone picked up more than movement. Her voice was relaxed, confident. "This should be the final complaint we need," she said, as if discussing a grocery list. "Once they remove him from command, the rest will fall into place." A pause, a faint laugh. "These military families bring property values down," she continued. "They never stay. They don't integrate. It's better for everyone if they move on." She lowered her voice then, conspiratorial. "Military trash," she said casually. "You know how it is." The words sat there, unfiltered, unambiguous, undeniable. She wasn't angry. She wasn't provoked. She wasn't exaggerating for effect. She was explaining her strategy to someone who understood exactly what she meant. I watched the clip twice, then a third time, this time with the volume lower, the way you do when you already know what you're going to hear. The timestamps matched the follow-up emails she'd sent to the federal inbox. The phrasing mirrored the spreadsheet. The intent aligned perfectly with the network map on my wall. This wasn't an opinion caught out of context. It was motive. I exported the file, verified the checksum, pulled the raw audio stream, preserved the original metadata. Then I placed copies in 2 secure locations and sent one to legal counsel with a single line of text. Smoking gun attached. An hour later, my phone rang. "Colonel," Lieutenant Colonel Webb said, her voice noticeably cooler than before. "Did the individual in question make this statement voluntarily?" "Yes," I replied. "Was she aware she was being recorded?" "No." There was a brief pause, paper moving, keys clicking. "Understood," she said. "This changes the posture of the case." That evening, Karen escalated again. She stood in her driveway, phone raised, narrating into the air like a documentary narrator without an audience. She positioned herself behind my truck as I loaded groceries, stepping closer than necessary. "He's aggressive," she said loudly. "You can see it, the body language." My backup camera caught everything, including the part where she stepped into the path and then recued it, announcing into her phone that I was attempting to run her over. The audio told a different story. "I'll stand right here," she said just before moving. "This will do it." It did. Because when you combine false statements with recorded intent, the narrative collapses. I sent the second clip to Webb. Her response came faster this time. "Do not engage further," she wrote. "Preserve all recordings. We will handle contact." That night, I slept for the first time in days. Not because I felt safe, because I felt finished waiting. By morning, the complaint was no longer under review. It was under investigation. Karen had believed the power of paperwork lay in repetition, in volume, in sounding official long enough that no one checked. She hadn't counted on silence, on cameras that don't argue, on microphones that don't flinch. Most of all, she hadn't counted on herself. People like Karen don't get caught because they slip. They get caught because they talk. And when they do, they reveal the one thing no amount of documentation can hide: intent. The next step wouldn't be dramatic. No arrests, no announcements, just a formal notice, a time, a place, and an invitation she could not ignore. Because once you confess, on record, The system stops listening to explanations and starts asking questions. The notice went out on a Wednesday morning. No drama, no explanation, just a time, a location, and language so formal it left no room for interpretation. You are requested to appear. Karen received it the same way everyone receives a document they don't understand yet, through assumptions. She assumed it meant leverage. She assumed it meant victory. She assumed she'd finally pushed the right buttons. She was wrong. At 13:55 hours, her white SUV rolled through the front gate. Base security treated it like any other vehicle entering controlled space. Slow, methodical, thorough. The guard asked her to step out, open the trunk, unlock the back seat. Routine, unavoidable. I watched from my office window as she waited, arms crossed, irritation written across her posture. Civilians always underestimate how quiet military spaces are. There's no music, no chatter, just procedure. The conference room was already prepared. Flags behind the table, country and branch. Climate control humming at a steady, indifferent pitch. A recorder centered between 3 folders placed with equal spacing. Chairs aligned to the inch. I didn't sit at the head. I sat to the side. Agent Morrison from the FBI took the center seat. Major Stevens from JAG sat to her left. Lieutenant Colonel Webb stood near the wall, arms folded, observing. When Karen was escorted in, she paused. The room didn't look like what she expected. She straightened her blazer anyway, smoothed her hair, lifted her chin. I was told I'd be speaking about a complaint, she said. Already defensive, already framing the story. Agent Morrison gestured to the chair across from her. Please, have a seat. Karen sat. I said nothing. Silence is unsettling to people who rely on momentum. Agent Morrison slid a single sheet of paper across the table. Mrs. Ashford, she said calmly, this is the report you submitted to a federal agency alleging abuse of authority, intimidation, and misconduct. Karen glanced at it. Yes, that's correct. And you affirm that the statements contained within are accurate to the best of your knowledge? Absolutely. Morrison nodded. She didn't argue, she didn't challenge. She turned on the recorder. Let the record reflect that the witness affirms the accuracy of her prior statements. Then she opened the second folder. Now we'll play an audio recording captured on a private security system on the afternoon of March 12th. Karen frowned. I don't consent to... Morrison raised a hand. Consent is not required. This is evidence. She pressed a button. Karen's voice filled the room. This should be the final complaint we need. Once they remove him from command, the rest will fall into place. A pause. Military trash brings property values down. No echo, no distortion, just her voice. Unmistakable. Karen froze. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Her eyes flicked to me for the first time since she entered the room. I didn't react. Morrison stopped the recording. Mrs. Ashford, she said, can you explain this statement? Karen's composure cracked, not loudly, but visibly. A breath too shallow, a blink too fast. That's out of context, she said. I was frustrated. I was speaking generally. Morrison nodded and opened the third folder. Here is a spreadsheet authored and maintained by you, she said, turning the pages so Karen could see. It categorizes residents by military status. It tracks escalation. It lists target to remove. Karen's face drained of color. Major Stevens leaned forward slightly. You should know that systematic targeting of service members and their families may implicate federal protections. Karen laughed once. Too sharp. This is intimidation, she said. You can't treat civilians like criminals. Morrison didn't raise her voice. We're not. We're documenting. She slid one more page across the table. And here is the deed transfer for a property purchased by an LLC you control, following foreclosure of a military family after coordinated HOA and school pressure. Karen stared at the paper. Silence returned to the room, heavy and complete. She had arrived expecting spectacle. What she found was process. She finally looked at me. You did this, she said, bitterness breaking through. I met her eyes for the first time. No, I said evenly. You did. The words hung there, not as accusation, as fact. Agent Morrison closed the folders. Mrs. Ashford, she said, based on the evidence presented, this matter is now under federal investigation for false official statements, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. Karen stood abruptly. I want a lawyer. Of course, Morrison replied. You're free to retain one. She paused, then added, You're also free to leave. Karen hesitated, confused by the absence of handcuffs, by the lack of shouting. She'd expected force. Instead, she'd been met with certainty. As she was escorted out, she looked back one last time, not defiant, not triumphant, just small. After the door closed, the room exhaled. Webb nodded once. Stevens gathered the files. Morrison stopped the recorder. This is solid, she said. We'll proceed. I stood, not relieved, resolved, because the summons wasn't the end. It was the beginning of consequences. Consequences don't arrive all at once. They arrive quietly. In envelopes, in phone calls returned later than expected, in meetings where the tone has changed and nobody needs to explain why. Within 72 hours, the HOA board suspended enforcement actions pending review. Within a week, Karen resigned her position for personal reasons. Within a month, the board itself was dissolved and replaced by an interim committee with outside oversight. No announcements, no apologies, just correction. The federal process moved the way it always does, methodically. Interviews, subpoenas, corroboration. The spreadsheet wasn't a theory anymore, it was evidence. The recordings weren't context-dependent. They were clear. The foreclosure records closed the loop. Karen's attorney called once. He didn't argue facts. He asked about scope. That told me everything. The settlement came later, restitution for affected families, civil penalties, restrictions on future involvement in housing governance, no dramatic courtroom scene, no victory speech. Justice doesn't need an audience. It needs permanence. My family felt the change before the paperwork finalized. The calls stopped. The notes stopped. The sideways looks faded. My daughters walked to school without scanning faces. Their laughter returned in full volume, the way it only does when kids believe the world has steadied again. Emma was reinstated, quietly, with an email that used the word oversight 3 times and error once. Sarah asked me one night if the police were coming back. No, I told him, not for us. He nodded, trusted it, went back to his homework. My father noticed the difference too. One morning, as he watered his tomatoes, he looked up at me with unexpected clarity. That woman, he said, slow but certain, she was like the political officers overseas. Same hunger, same smile. Then the fog returned. But I didn't forget the moment, because he was right. People like Karen don't see themselves as villains. They see themselves as organizers, correctors, necessary hands on levers they believe others are too timid to pull. What they don't understand is that paperwork doesn't make something clean. Intent does. My wife came home not long after. We didn't celebrate. We unpacked. We cooked. We sat on the porch and listened to the neighborhood settle into itself again. Stability isn't loud. It's reassuring. Weeks later, a letter arrived from a family I'd never met. They'd heard about what happened. They'd been dealing with something similar 2 towns over. We didn't think anyone would take it seriously, the letter said. Now we're documenting. That's how this spreads. Not fear, confidence. Here's what I learned. Most systems don't fail because of bad rules. They fail because good people assume someone else will step in. They fail when silence feels safer than record keeping. When it's not worth the trouble becomes a habit. Karen counted on that. She assumed nobody would connect the dots. She assumed authority was loud and obvious. She assumed a uniform meant intimidation. She was wrong. Authority is quiet. It documents. It waits. And when necessary, it acts. The call she made that morning in my driveway was meant to humiliate, to assert control, to remind a neighbor that power belonged to her paperwork. Instead, it exposed her, not because of who I am, but because of what she chose to do. And sometimes, that's the lesson worth remembering. Hatred doesn't need shouting. Discrimination doesn't need signs. Abuse of power often hides behind forms, meetings, and smiles, but it always leaves a trail, and when someone finally follows it, patiently, carefully, without emotion, the truth doesn't need defending. It stands on its own. That's how this ended, not with anger, with clarity, and a neighborhood that learned something important the hard way. You can call the police on a man for parking in his own driveway. Just be sure you understand who's really listening and what happens when they do.